Time for the Daly Planet podcast show. Sit back, relax, and give us a go. Scott and Matt and maybe a guest, undertaking an epic pod quest. We're gonna ramble on about movies and books and television and directors and film festivals and this really long list of stuff that I know nothing about, but they gave it to me and they really wanted me to read through it. And that's all I can really say about it, but it's gonna be great. Okay, start the show.
Hello and welcome to the Daly Planet podcast, your weekly podcast for all things movies, TV, books, and anything else we feel like talking about. My name is Scott and I am your host, and I'm joined as always by my co-host and co-structural story expert, Matt Freeman. Matt, how's it going today?
It's going very well, Scott. I'm glad that you're back and that we can resume our project of saving the world.
One film at a time.
One film at a time, one critique and ineffective suggestion at a time.
Yeah. So we're here. We're doing something a little bit different this time, Matt. We're here to talk about story structure. And specifically, we're here to talk about the 3-act structure that is so pervasive in films these days.
And controversial, too, which is interesting. And I think we're going to get into that.
Yeah, it really, as I really dove into the research for this, it surprised me at how controversial it is, and how, I think you could Google search anything and find 20 completely different opinions that support the 3-act structure, that all support it for different reasons, and then the same on the other side that say it's terrible, and all for different reasons. It's really interesting.
Yeah. I think one of our objectives today is going to be to actually dissolve that controversy rather than solve it and say one side is right. I actually think what we're going to end up doing is dissolving it and saying both sides have good points and they're talking past each other to a large degree, but we're going to get into all that detail later. Yeah,
absolutely. But first, let's talk some news. It's been a little while, Matt. We get caught up in all our other stuff and forget to talk about news. We've got some bad news, Matt. First of all, I don't know if you've heard of the movie A Dog's Purpose.
I have heard about this.
They are currently advertising the hell out of this movie right now because I think it comes out in the first week in February. I think. Did we talk about this one on our preview? I don't think we did.
I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
So this is the movie where Josh Gad, brilliant, hilarious comedian Josh Gad, there's a little sarcasm there, plays a series of dogs that he dies and then is reborn. The movie is nonsense, but TMZ broke a story this week that it appears that they did some inappropriate things with the dog, trying to force it into water that it did not want to go into, and they have video to prove that they did this. I don't know if you've watched this video, Matt.
No, I didn't. I saw a picture, and it just looks like someone pushing a dog, and the dog didn't want to go. That was all I really saw.
Yeah, so
the headline, of course.
So first of all, I just want to say generally, I think this is a really dumb movie, and I'm not going to see the movie anyway. But I watched the video, and it really kind of just it looks like the dog just didn't want to get in the water. They tried to get the dog into the water a few times. It didn't go. And then suddenly the dog, they didn't throw the dog in the water. They place the dog in the water. It immediately tried to get out, and the trainer pulls the dog out. And then it cuts to a second scene where the dog is in the water swimming and suddenly goes under. And as soon as the dog goes under, their crew people immediately rush the dog and get it to safety. So it feels that there's something missing between these two different videos. Because there's never a video where you see the dog thrown in the water and then it clearly doesn't want to be there. It's just something. There's something missing. There's some clever editing, and I think TMZ is a miserable piece of shit organization. So I'm not surprised if they did some editing here. But
yeah, I'm thinking the dog union is probably trying to use this as a negotiating tactic.
Right, and these films, they have we've come a long way from Milo and Otis and the terrible things they did on that film. There's people, and you can even see in the video, the second they thought the dog was in any kind of danger, people swarmed him. So while I agree, it's on the surface it seems bad because they're forcing the dog to get in the water and it really didn't want to. I've done that with my dog in the bath before. My dog doesn't want to take a bath, and I have to force the dog into the bathtub. So I don't know. I mean, I think it seems to me like this is being a little blown out of proportion. But that's just my opinion. I love dogs, but that's my opinion.
I didn't watch the video, obviously, but it is funny how people who've never had dogs have so many opinions about how to how to take care of dogs, and people who've never had kids have so many opinions about how to take care of kids.
Of course, everybody has opinions.
Yep.
Yeah. That being said, as much as I love dogs, the only thing it takes for me to hate a dog is making it voiced by Josh Gad. So that's the state we're in.
Yeah, it's kind of like how Ridley Scott picked Matt Damon to be in his movie to balance out the complete coldness of Ridley Scott. They're choosing. They're like, well, we're going to have Josh Gad in the movie, so we need to balance out the fact that it's Josh Gad
with
by
an adorable dog.
Having it be dogs, yeah.
I like it. Yeah. All right. The other thing, I think this just broke today, was that The Rock is joining the DC Expanded Universe. I think that's what DCEU means. They're making a Shazam movie, basically. I don't know if you know who the character of Shazam is. I don't have a lot of background into him. I know his basic concept, but The Rock's going to be in the Shazam movie. He's playing the bad guy, Black Adam. That's all we really know. I don't think they've cast Shazam or his child alter ego, because I think the whole thing with Shazam is he's a kid, and then he says Shazam and turns into a big, strong guy. Not the most interesting superhero in the world, but
right. I mean, it is, like, from what I've seen of it, it just looks silly. So I hope DC goes with it and makes it silly, because that would be fun. But I have a feeling DC is going to make this a grimdark movie about a kid who says Shazam and turns into a big, strong superhero
with a lightning bolt on his chest or whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's not going to be a lightning bolt. They're going to change it. It's going to be a skull.
Oh, of course.
DC now. Yeah.
But I will say that The Rock saves franchises. That's what he does. Yeah, so if anyone can fix the DC universe, it's The Rock.
Yeah, I wonder if The Rock just goes into like these Hollywood meetings, and just the fact that he's like huge and intimidating, he's just like, look,
put me in
this is what we're going to do to fix this movie.
The answer, as always, is me.
Yeah.
Well, it's been working. Although I think this is going to be an interesting year, because I think we might be into Rock overexposure this year. He's in the Baywatch movie. He's going to be in the Jumanji sequel. I think he's got some other stuff coming out that I haven't even thought of. Fast and Furious, of course.
Yeah, he was just in Moana, and which I love. I
mean, and he was legitimately wonderful in that film. But I think he might just be getting overexposed at this point. I've heard from people that have read the Jumanji 2 script that it is not good. So we'll see. I don't know. That's Rock, though. And finally, for another piece of shit news, that's going to be funny in a second, listeners. Patrick Stewart is playing the poop emoji in the Emoji Movie. So this is a movie we did talk about on our 2017 preview. Yeah. And I don't think either of us had very nice things to say about it. And what do you think of this?
I mean, I get it. I get the idea of like, okay, we're making the Emoji Movie. I don't know why, but we are. We there's the poop emoji. We have to have a voice for it. Okay, what's the funniest choice we can make? Well, maybe a proper British person. What about Patrick Stewart? Oh, he'd never do it. He'd never do that. Oh, he said yes. All right.
I guess we got to make this movie now because Patrick Stewart said yes. Yeah, it's funny because we saw the trailer and the poop in the stupid little teaser talks like a formal British person, and I remember mentioning that, but it never like occurred to me that was Patrick Stewart.
That's good. It means that you still have some hope left in your heart.
That's true. I mean, he's obviously going for a paycheck here. It's voice work. It's probably like 2 or 3 days worth of work because I'm sure he's not like a huge character in the film. But I don't know. This is a bad idea for a movie. I guess kids are going to love it. Kids love emojis. I don't understand.
I don't understand either. I mean, it's just a thing. It's just a thing that people recognize. That's how they make movies now. They're just like, people will recognize this, and they're so stupid that they will go see a movie just because they recognize it. That's their mentality anyway. I have more faith in you people, you know. I have more faith. Speaking of Patrick Stewart, I saw like the Red Band Logan trailer.
Oh my god!
And Patrick Stewart says a swear in that. It's kind of shocking.
But it was, dude. I've tried really hard to not get excited about that movie, and the more I see about it, like, is it going to be good? Like, it could actually be good.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like I don't want to say a safe formula because that has wrong connotations. More like the kind of formula where you're like, yeah, this can work. You know, like it kind of feels like Dread, the more recent one, in terms of like, it's just it's a crusty old guy and a younger, in this case, much younger female character, and they kind of have to get through a tough thing where there's people trying to kill him, and it's all just heartwarming fun.
Are we in agreement though that Xavier is definitely dying by the end of this film? Like, I'm
probably, unless
99% sure.
Unless they're going some weird direction. But didn't he already die in an X-Men movie? I mean,
yeah, and then he came back. It doesn't. The X-Men timeline. Let's just pretend like this movie does not fit anywhere into the actual X-Men universe.
I was highly confused because there's a scene in this movie where Wolverine is flipping through a literal X-Men comic, and you see the Wolverine in like the yellow spandex, and I'm like, wait a second, is this like a interuniversal teleportation thing? But then inside the movie, it seems more like it's just like the X-Men have become so famous that they actually made comic books about them.
Which is a really cool idea. I love it.
Yeah. And
it's funny that, he is wearing the yellow spandex in the comic, which he never actually has in any of the X-Men movies.
Right.
So that's the only time we're going to get to see yellow spandex Wolverine. Since this is Jackman's final film, I think. Not that they won't recast Wolverine at the first available opportunity, but
that's true. They've got to do now that they've done old Logan. They've got to do they've got to do Weapon X, where he just becomes Wolverine,
didn't they
where
do
he gets
that
his
already?
powers. I think they probably did.
That's the one where Ryan Reynolds played the other version of Deadpool.
Yes, but that was where he got his adamantium, but that wasn't where he got his powers.
Yeah, you're right. Oh god,
got to have another movie to show where he gets his powers.
I'm so angry with you right now. All right. So that's all the news I got. I'm sure there'll be some new exciting stuff coming up to talk about next week. But right now, let's talk about structure, because you can guarantee one thing the Emoji Movie will have is a 3-act structure to it.
Yeah, I guarantee it.
So Matt, my idea behind this was, we talk a lot about movies and story on this podcast. And we toss around buzzwords a lot, like we know what we're talking about and like we assume everyone else knows what we're talking about. But I wasn't sure necessarily if people did. I think your average moviegoer does not know what the 3-act structure is. They wouldn't know what an act is outside of like in a play.
Yeah.
And it turns out that actually defining what an act is actually controversial on its own. That most people have different definitions of what an act is. So before we go on with this, I wanted to quickly define. Obviously, the idea of an act came from plays and performances. The Greeks had no acts. I think the Romans had 5. Shakespeare had 5. But they were basically just breaks in the play so people could go to the bathroom. I mean, that's the start of an act. The modern interpretation of this is breaks in television shows so you can have commercials. So there really is no structural need in a film, in a story sense, for there to be an act break. But theory on film says that you can normally divide a story into a series of acts based on character motivations and character decisions and just story elements as they go on. The 3-act structure has become the most popular one, and I think that comes from Campbell, right? That's part of the monomyth.
Yeah, I think so. He certainly works the act structure into his monomyth and states where the various monomyth components go in the cycle. So that's what you just said, that as a sort of a critical, the act structures normally are, and I might say should be used as a critical tool to help break down a movie and understand it better. And then there are some who actually use it as a tool for creating stories, which I think is where a lot of the controversy enters into it, actually.
I think so too, and I think what we're going to be discussing a lot today is those differences, and I think when people complain about the 3-act structure as it relates to modern Hollywood films, their complaints mostly come from the fact that studios have taken this model and decided somewhere along the way that all movies need to hold to this structure, and when screenwriters are developing movies or trying to sell movies, one of the first questions you will be asked is, what are your 3 acts? And if you don't have them, then suddenly your script isn't worth anything. And I can understand where the frustration comes with that. But I don't think that means that the structure by itself doesn't have any merit.
Yeah.
But before we go on, let's define what the 3-act structure is in the simplest way. It's beginning, middle, and end, right? I mean, that's the simplest division, and it gets more complicated than that, and we'll go through it. But in the simplest terms, Act 1 is where you set your stakes. Act 2 is the rising action, and Act 3 is your climax in the simplest structure. And
yeah,
So go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Just because we're going to be editorializing and putting in our opinions, in my opinion, just saying that by itself is not very useful, because if you're like, it's in every story you got to introduce the characters and then have them do things and then end it. Like that's not that's not an insight. That's just like, yep, that's going to be true whether the movie is good or bad. It's banal. What's potentially useful about that framework, in my opinion, is the act breaks, because usually the end of the first act is considered to be the point where the characters have to make a choice about whether they're going to move on from the status quo that they were living in and that has been established up to that point into confronting whatever it is that's going to be the conflict of the movie. And then the break between the second and third act is more typically the characters have to make another decision, or the protagonist has to make another decision about whether they're going to make some particular change or sacrifice or decision that will allow them to resolve the problem. And the act is not considered to be shifted generally until the character has irreversibly made this decision. So I think that helps a lot, because it changes it from a banal and nearly useless framework to being like, oh, I get it. Like, something actually has to change between Act 1 and Act 2. There is actually a line. It's not just like, yep, beginning and middle. There is a line.
Yeah. I agree. And I think that serves the importance of having an act structure to begin with, is to help define and identify those moments. Because I think any good story is going to have a moment where your protagonist has to make a decision, and it's a irreversible decision. And I think that's how Film Crit Hulk, and we have a bunch of references to articles and stuff we've researched for this, and we'll include them in the show notes. But one of them was Film Crit Hulk's, I think it's a chapter out of his book Screenwriting 101, which is a great book on screenwriting. But he's very anti 3-act structure, and he kind of deconstructs the whole thing, and he calls it the myth of the 3 acts. But one of the things he says is that the easiest way to identify an act, and therefore an act break, is that point of no return decision that the character makes. So the other thing I wanted to talk about relation to this is a YouTube video that I think we both watched by film critic Lindsay Ellis. You might know her in the past as Nostalgia Chick. She was on Channel Awesome with the nostalgia guy. I forget his name. But
Nostalgia Critic.
There you go. There it is. But she's gone off on her own now and done some really insightful, like, long form video essays. This being one of them. She is a very much a proponent of the 3-act structure, and she divides those 3 acts further into what she calls 8 sequences, and I think this is probably I'm not sure, it's not just her. She probably got this from film school or something. I've looked around and didn't see it broken down like this elsewhere, but I think it works for what we're trying to talk about. So Matt, you want to go through the acts, and we were trying to pick a movie that best exemplifies what the 3-act structure is. And I tried to pick something else because I feel like we talk about Star Wars so much, but Star Wars is actually the perfect example of this because it kind of makes sense because the hero's journey and the monomyth, like Star Wars was crafted to adhere to that very closely. It's kind of what all modern film has copied since then, but
right. And it's it's probably the most successful example. The original Star Wars film is probably the most successful example of the monomyth and maybe even the most successful of the 3-act structure since Shakespeare's plays were not 3-act structures.
Yeah, which spoiler for later in the podcast.
Yeah, right. So yeah, I'll go through these if you don't mind, Scott.
Yeah, go for it.
So according to Lindsay, there are 2 sequences in the first act, 4 in the second act, and then 2 in the third act. The first sequence is called the point of attack, which is the incident that gets the ball rolling, and it's usually outside of the protagonist's control or even knowledge. In this case, it'll be Leia hiding the plans inside R2-D2, which Luke has no idea about, but it is the action that gets the ball rolling.
Mm-hmm.
The inciting incident, which marks the end of the first sequence, so we're still in the first sequence, is where the conflict comes in line with the protagonist, which is where R2-D2 shows up at Luke's farm in Star Wars. And then the second sequence in Act 1 would be when the protagonist makes the decision, which is, the irreversible decision. In this case, Luke decides to go on the quest with Obi-Wan and become a Jedi like his father. Then we move on to sequence 3, which is the start of Act 2, where the protagonist makes progress. In Star Wars, they get on a ship and escape from Tatooine. Sequence 4, it builds to the midpoint of the story, in which will normally change the aim of the protagonist's quest. So in this case, the Death Star destroys Alderaan, so their plan is no longer bring the plans to Alderaan. The plan is, the plan is escape from the Death Star once that happens. So the plan changes a few times, I guess.
Yeah.
Sequence 5 is where the main problems of the second act come on.
Yeah, and that note was really just when people talk about how films these days have second act problems a lot.
Yeah.
And they're talking about this sequence majorly when they're mentioning that this is because even in Star Wars, when we were sitting down trying to think of what to plug into sequence 5, I didn't really have anything. This sequence is usually where some of the side story comes, and it's like mostly just characters hang out until the end of the act.
Yeah, there's a big risk of films treading water here. In fact, I would even go so far as to say sequence 3 and sequence 5. Sequence 3 is called Protagonist Makes Progress, which is like,
so they do a little bit to achieve their goal.
Yeah, like that's about as nondescript as the phrase rising action to describe it's like, as Hulk says, which I laugh at every time I read it. He's like, so what does that mean? You take the action and you rise it. It's like, that's so unhelpful from like a thinking about how to actually execute things point of view.
Mm-hmm.
But then we move past that to sequence 6, which is called the main culmination, the end of Act 2 and the resolution of the main conflict. The trio escape the Death Star and get the plans for the Rebel base. Then sequence 7, which I believe is the start of Act 3,
mm-hmm.
The protagonist makes a decision that defines the final conflict of Act 3. Act 3 conflict usually comes out of the main story-wide conflict, but is slightly different. So in this case, the main conflict of Star Wars was for Luke to help get the Death Star plans to the rebellion, but now the Act 3 conflict is Luke deciding to help fight with the rebellion against the Death Star. And then the twist in the third act, it changes the focus of the conflict to be more personal, not necessarily a twist as we know it, just a slight shift or narrowing of conflict. So in this case, all the other X-Wings are destroyed, and now it's up to Luke. and it becomes a personal conflict where he accepts the Force into his soul in order to succeed. And then the climax, which is sequence 8, is the climax, is the resolution of the third act conflict, where Luke blows up the Death Star, and the character growth in the third act is usually something to do with the things that were established in the very first sequence. Which
is funny, because when we were breaking this down, I said this to you, that I realized that according to this model, Star Wars has a bit of a problem, because the climax of the film is Luke accepting in the Force in order to win, but his doubt of the Force was never really established earlier in the film. The sequence 1 establishes him as a character. It defines his wants, which is to eventually join the rebellion and get off his boring planet. But the Force acceptance doesn't really tie into that at all.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna suggest an improvement to Star Wars: A New Hope, one of the best films ever made, which would be when Han is making fun of the Force. Luke should actually seem skeptical of the Force instead of just being like, whatever this crazy old man says. Because really, I don't know, at that point in the film, I don't even think he has any particular reason to like trust that Obi-Wan isn't just an old kook.
Yeah.
It isn't until later that Obi-Wan like sort of demonstrates some power. And I don't know if Obi-Wan even ever demonstrates any particular power in front of Luke. So it's funny, Luke has almost no reason to believe in the Force, and has every reason to doubt it, but we never really see him doubt it. He's just kind of like, oh, I hear Obi-Wan's voice. I guess I'll turn off the targeting computer. Plot hole, this movie sucks.
Yeah, and I mean, this is, to me, why these structures are important, because we can take this, and I'm never going to not say Star Wars isn't a great movie, but we can take this kind of structural thing and analyze conflict and analyze how things are established and pay off, and use the structure to kind of find those areas where it doesn't achieve what it does, or we can see exactly how it does achieve what it was trying to do.
Yes.
And that's where I think it's important, and that's where I think, it's funny, because the Lindsay Ellis video we watched was in direct response to Hulk's article, just completely destructing the 3X structure, and like you mentioned earlier in the podcast, they were kind of talking past each other. One person is saying, from a writing perspective, you shouldn't define everything you write based on this rigid structure, which is a truism. But the other person saying you can use this rigid structure to help critique and form theory on how and why films work, which is also true.
Or why they don't work.
Exactly.
Which really is true, because the way I think of these things, again, editorializing, is that stories are really made up of instances of setting things up and resolving them.
Right.
And I've heard another writer who I really admire state that as opening parentheses and closing parentheses, and just like computer code, you have to close every parentheses that you open or it doesn't compile. And people definitely get disappointed in certain types of stories if you set something up and you never resolve it. People are going to walk out of the theater being like, hey, whatever happened with such and such, and people call it like a dropped plot line or something like that. But there can be very subtle things that are set up and not resolved that are very hard to point out. Mm-hmm. When you have an act structure, when you have some kind of structure where you can at least credibly map it onto your story, then that allows you to see like, oh, I didn't realize this, but this character of mine doesn't seem to be sufficiently motivated to make this decision at this point, because I see in this act structure outline that there should be this stage earlier where the character gains that motivation through some loss, and I didn't give my character that loss, and that actually makes perfect sense. And now I actually like feel that this is a problem with my story, and so that's probably the most useful way that I would personally use act structures in my own writing, is actually to just say, like, oh, if I'm breaking down my own story as if I were a critic, I can see where it's missing pieces.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think the biggest problem is this idea of strict adherence to the structure, and this idea that, like, for example, I went through and I picked what these sequences were, and I picked these act breaks, and I picked exactly what it was. Someone else could do the same thing and pick completely different moments. And I think we would, especially with a movie like Star Wars, which is a relatively simple story structure, would probably find some similarities to mine, but they could find different parts that sequence 5 falls in, or it's very much up to interpretation, and everyone is going to come to a structural theory with a different viewpoint and a different perspective on it. So the trouble comes when you look at it as a rigid, unbreakable structure.
Right. And you know, Han Solo has his own story arc within this movie that doesn't line up particularly well with the overall movie's sequence of
Absolutely.
beats.
And he has his own act breaks,
Right.
independent of what the main story is doing. You're absolutely right. So I think the complaint that most movies have second act problems is true, but it's because when you're constructing a script, like when you're making a story and you know what your setup is and you know what your payoff is, but then you have this whole middle that's 60 pages of your script, 45 minutes of your film, 45 to 60 minutes of your film, and all that's necessary for is to get you to the place that you need to be for the conflict, for the climax to pay off, then of course the second act's going to be boring, because like you're not defining anything specifically within that structure. You're just saying, like you said, rising action. That doesn't that by itself means nothing.
Right.
And
it can be very meandering in some movies.
And the fact is that you should, like, there should be mini arcs and mini acts going on within that second act that change things, and this Lindsay's theory kind of points to that, where in the midpoint of a film normally slightly alters the aim of the protagonist. Their main conflict shifts slightly, but I mean that should be happening several times throughout the second act, quote unquote, of the film. So Matt, there is another structure that I think you tend to like more.
I do.
It's called the 5-act structure, because there are 5 acts. And it was it came from a little known author named William Shakespeare.
Yep. And I believe another little known author who uses it in his movies is Quentin Tarantino, who we may have mentioned on the podcast before.
Yeah, he's this rising star in the world of film.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the whole idea of first of all, we'll say once again that Shakespeare himself did not write his plays with a 5-act structure in mind. His plays, when they were later transcribed and written down, were divided into these 5 acts. So again, this is theory working its way to establish structure on something that wasn't written with structure in mind, at least consciously. But again, it's just a way to look at something and divide it.
Yeah.
So you want to go through those?
Sure. Yeah. And I think Shakespeare definitely had a theory of writing plays.
Yeah.
I just don't think he necessarily used these terms. So let's see. So the acts are called, the first act is called the exposition, and that tends to be essentially the introduction of the pre-existing conflict. And you can actually notice that this also happens in Star Wars, and it's essentially that, you know, and it really helps with the immersion of any story. If you're like, yeah, here's the situation, everything is not idyllic. There is actually this pre-existing conflict between powers, and maybe the protagonist is embedded in that in some way. So the ball is actually already rolling when the story starts. And I think you'll find, if you pay attention to movies, that like if the movie starts out with the ball already rolling, then you kind of already know the writer knows what they're doing, and this is going to be a better than normal movie. Mm-hmm. Act 2 is called the rising action, or defining the conflict. Yeah, I think defining the conflict is probably more accurate for there. I think the rising action's a leftover buzzword. Yeah. I forget what distinguishes this one, because I don't have it written down here. So the exposition is defining the pre-existing conflicts, and Act 2 is defining the specific conflict in the story. So the example, the Romeo and Juliet example, is
Act 1 defines that these two houses are fighting. It defines Romeo is in love with Rosaline. Act 2 is actually where Romeo and Juliet would meet and fall in love, even though their love is forbidden. So it's defined the personal conflict that takes place over the course of the story.
Yeah, and it's raising the complications and the stakes, because now the protagonist wasn't personally involved with it, but now he kind of has a lot to lose because of this conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third act, which is interesting to me, the third act is called the climax, and that's, in one sense, you tend to think of the climax as being closer to the end, but in this structure, the climax is the middle, and this is the turning point, and it's characterized by sort of a vast escalation of conflict and tension and stakes. And I think Romeo and Juliet is a great example for this one, because it's like one of the most dramatic moments of the play is actually kind of the middle, where Tybalt kills Mercutio and Romeo kills Tybalt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we hear we hear climax and we think the end, kind of naturally. But I think all that this is saying is that we're reaching, like, we're building to a point of dramatic shift, right? Everything builds, the tension and the conflict builds to this point, and then an irreversible shift happens at the height of the tension, which is Romeo killing Tybalt after Tybalt kills Mercutio, and now we've reached a point of no return. And that leads us into basically the end of the play, which is technically on the graph of a 5-act structure. We're technically like lowering action now, heading towards your resolution, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not like a big climax of the play. It just means that we've reached a point of no return, a point of change.
Right, and that can actually be very dramatic in the 5-act structure. I think that's one of the more useful ways to think about it, because in the fourth act, the characters are actually reacting to the events of the climax.
Right.
And so if the climax was sufficiently dramatic, their reactions should be somewhat dramatic and hectic, and they should make bad choices, partially on the basis of the drama and partially on the basis of their character flaws, because all good stories have flawed characters, and the character flaws kind of drive the plot and drive the decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So they make whatever decisions they make, and everything wraps up in the denouement or resolution. I forget whether the lovers killing themselves would fall into the end of the fourth act or the beginning of the fifth act.
And see, that's where I think it falls to interpretation. In my opinion, that would fall as part of the denouement. I think, in my opinion, Act 4 would be them hatching their plot to fake their deaths, and that would break Act 4. So they make these decisions. Act 4 is called the spiral for a reason, because things are literally spiraling out of control, and characters are behaving ridiculously and making choices that are going to affect the end of the play, or story. So in my opinion, that them actually dying would be part of Act 5, but you might get a different interpretation from someone else.
Yeah, and I mean, one interesting thing about this, now that I'm thinking about it, is like, if you look at a lot of Marvel movies, people complain sometimes that all the Marvel movies have the same structure, and I think there's actually some credence to that. Yeah,
and it the funny thing is, it is this structure, and that kind of serves to defend the idea that even creating with the structure in mind can work, as long as you're creating something good.
Right. They usually, I think they usually actually, like, every Marvel movie ends with a big action scene, but that big action scene would actually be in the denouement or resolution,
mm-hmm.
not the climax. The climax of the movie was the thing that happened earlier in the movie, when the hero had to do some big dramatic thing that kind of, if it's the origin story, it's the time that he had to make the decision where he is now actually the hero instead of just the guy who's becoming the hero, you know?
Yeah, and that's another big misconception too, is that climax, like we call it rising action and climax, and when you're dealing with a Hollywood blockbuster movie, you tend to think, oh, well, this is where the big fight is. But the climax has to do with character motivations and tension and conflict, and not necessarily with big action sequence. That's not what it's talking about. So that's a good point.
Yeah. The thing I like about the 5-act structure over the 3-act structure is that it makes it more clear. If for example, you're imposing it on your own stories, it makes it really clear where you're missing tension, because and tension is another buzzword, Scott, that I think we use a lot on the podcast.
That's true.
And never define. But like the idea, and it took me a long time to get this, but the idea is that if you're writing something, every moment essentially should have tension. Like the audience should be engaged and maybe a little bit worried and concerned about what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. This is true regardless of what type of movie you have. This can be a sex comedy, and you still have tension about, like, okay, well, is the guy going to get with the girl? You have tension about, is the blue laser thing in the sky going to blow up the world? Or but really, I mean, that's actually a bit of a joke, because usually the tension is actually, is the hero going to be able to conquer his own problems, which will allow himself to blow up the blue thing or whatever. If it's just about the blue thing, then you don't really care, because the stakes in films are always personal, and you always care way more about the hero's personal problems than you care about the world, because you can't emotionally connect to the world in the movie because it's a movie. But anyway, this idea of tension, having to always be there, first of all, and having to be consistently ratcheted up and down. That's one problem I've always had in my writing is ratcheting it down and having like breathing moments, because that's one really important thing to even action movies is that they will actually let the tension abate. I would say probably after the climax. Usually, like the climax will happen. I'm still going by the Act 3 structure in my head here, and then. Instead of just immediately pile driving into like chaos and turmoil and then diving straight down to everyone dying, there's usually a lull of some kind where everyone kind of recoups and thinks about things, and their personal stakes are readjusted, and you see emotions on their faces.
Yeah, and I think that's in the 3-act structure, in the 8 sequence structure. That's what the twist, quote unquote, mm-hmm. twist is in that 3rd act, where you redefine the stakes of the conflict to make it more personal. And I do think that that's what a lot of modern blockbusters have issue with, is Transformers is a great example, that it's just like the last act of that film is just mindless destruction for 30 minutes, and you have to make it personal or it doesn't work. And those released moments of tension you're talking about are necessary, not even in the climax, but I would argue throughout the entire film, because if you take one tone of tension and keep ratcheting it up without ever releasing it, not only does it become completely unmanageable, but it gets boring, because you can't maintain that. Yeah, people just lose interest and they don't care. And it's just like you see mindless destruction of robots fighting each other for 20 minutes. It's not impressive anymore. You don't care.
Yeah, that's I'm thinking of the fact that there are many types of tension, actually.
Yeah.
And usually, if the writer is really good, they will ease up on one kind of tension, like are they going to survive this type of tension? And very masterfully, just as they're easing up on that, they're phasing in the okay, now that we're not afraid for our lives anymore, we have the characters are actually noticing each other's presence again, and now there's interpersonal tension, which should have already should be established and under the surface all the time, and you've got multiple levels of conflicts happening at the same time that are going to be resolved in their own pace and artistically woven together, hopefully.
Absolutely. And I think that's the cool thing about these kind of structures is like we were talking about earlier, you could the main structure of the film will be from the protagonist's point of view, because by definition the protagonist is the person who carries you through the conflict of the film or the story or whatever. But each side character can literally have their own 3 acts or their own 5 acts within the film itself. And they should, if they're well-defined characters, they should have their own wants and needs. They should have their own conflicts around those wants and needs playing off each other. And they should be hopefully resolved by the end of the movie. So those things can exist at the same time. Now, the primary one will always, by definition, be the protagonist of the film. But yeah, I mean, that's all those things should be occurring simultaneously.
Yeah, and I think people really notice it. What's really interesting to me about all of this story theory is that people know all of these things innately. Like, they really do. Like, people will walk out of a movie and they won't say like, "Oh, none of the tertiary characters had sufficient arcs." They won't use those words, but they'll say, "I just didn't really care about the characters," or they'll just say like, "That was boring." I think that's my favorite. Is like, if someone says a movie was boring, it's like, well, that's what you're really saying is that you didn't care about the characters.
Yep.
Not 95% of the time. So.
Yeah, and I think that is amazing that. And that's kind of why I like this podcast, because we can maybe put to words the things that people are feeling, that because they aren't ridiculously nerdy like us and spend hours reading about all this stuff, that they know it subconsciously, but they can't put it to words, and we can at least give them what those words are. Because yeah, I mean, if a character dies or something happens to a character and you don't care, it's not because you're a heartless monster. It's because the character was not properly established and set up.
Right.
And that all.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, I stepped on you, but I was just going to say, let's remember that in the movie Up, there's like a 1 minute. What is it? It's like 1 or 3 minutes or something. Wordless sequence where a character like basically is introduced, grows old, and dies, and everyone in the theater is like sobbing. So it's not hard to do this. You just have to know that you have to do it, you know. And I bet you, Matt, if you took that sequence, you could divide it into either 3 acts or 5 acts in some way, and it would follow that theory. And I think, and again, I don't think it's that Pixar set out and said this opening 5-minute sequence or whatever it is going to follow a 3-act structure or is going to follow a 5-act structure. I think those structures were created because that's just how to divide how you tell a story. Yeah. Like, just like you were saying before, that a story is a character making choices, like coming up against problems, making decisions based on their defined character traits, the consequences of those decisions, and hopefully the growth or overcoming the trial that occurs as a result of these conflicts being forced on them. I mean, that's a story. So these are just ways of attaching some sort of identifiable and defined structure to what is basically just human storytelling, like what we've been doing since we could speak. Yeah, it's kind of almost just like a descriptive tool, just saying like, these are the qualities of what humans appear to consider to be a good story. It's likely that if you're missing any of these qualities or steps, then it's likely that you've made a mistake. Now, and I'm certainly not going to say that you've made a mistake, because like one of the articles we read, there was a great point where they were like, in Nightcrawler, the main character has absolutely zero growth, and that's actually the most fascinating, and you know that's kind of the point.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I think that's the safest thing to say, is that, you know, we pick Star Wars because it's a very simple and traditional story. Even Up, like, if it's a kid's movie, if it's a mass appeal thing, it's probably going to follow this basic structure, just because that's how you tell a story that appeals to the most people. But that doesn't mean that every single story that exists has to follow this structure. Or, I mean, you can probably twist it into it. The Lindsay Ellis video we watched took some movies that are commonly like unbreakable into the 3-act structure, and she did it. She's obviously way more experienced on this than either of us, but I think that the biggest thing I've learned through my time studying film is that there are rules, and the rules are usually there for a good reason, but that certainly doesn't mean that you always have to follow them.
Yeah. I think it would be very interesting to try to break Song of Ice and Fire into acts. I don't think it would work at all.
Oh boy.
I don't think it would work at all because the thing is, first of all, you don't have a protagonist.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's just a perfect example of like, it's not a film. A film is a certain length of time, and you really need this kind of through line of like a protagonist, and you're following them and you're paying attention.
Absolutely.
You pay attention for about 2 hours, and then it's not gonna work anymore. Song of Ice and Fire is a billion-page book and several years of television shows. You actually need to have all these different characters, and all of them are experiencing different phases of what you might call arcs at different times.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a broader palette of storytelling than just this. Although you could still certainly say that within a given Game of Thrones episode, I wouldn't be surprised if you could a good episode. I wouldn't be surprised if you could break it into acts.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think TV actually follows a much closer 5-act structure than film does, and I think a lot of that's a result of commercials.
Yeah,
I think if you look at an hour-long episode of television, there are 4 commercial breaks that divide that hour into 5 separate instances, and because of the demands of TV, and that you need something at the end of that particular moment to make people want to come back after the commercials, you find that things break kind of easily into these 5 different areas that each have their own rising tension that is resolved at the beginning of the next act or when the show comes back from commercial break.
Yeah, especially if there's some show that you watch a lot, like if you binge watch, House or something like that,
mm-hmm.
You really start to see like, oh my God, every episode is the same. It even, they even have the commercial breaks at the same, like, this isn't a tumor.
And I think that is the danger. And like, that's the amazing part about this is I don't agree or disagree with any one person we researched for this podcast. I think everyone has good points. I think like anything in film, in stories, when it becomes too rigid and too stuck to, it becomes bad. And I think that's what we're seeing in Hollywood a lot, and that's why people have kind of turned on the whole idea of a 3-act structure, is because it's a very uniform, rigid type of thing that people feel like they're obligated to tailor their writing to while they're creating, and it makes it kind of boring. And and you're also seeing, like, one of the other things that I read about was you're seeing like that because everyone says there's a second act problem, like movies are trying to get rid of the second act. So you just have like a really long first act and a really long third act, which means like which basically by definition of the structure, it's set up. Suddenly everything's at the climax, and you're just like, wait, what? And that doesn't, like, you need those moments of like character interaction and little moments of building tension and releasing it to define who the characters are and see them fail, see them grow. Like, you can't, it's too abrupt if you do it like that. I think Fantastic Four a couple years ago was a great example of that, where it goes from first act into third act without warning. It's literally like noted by a time jump in the film. That's how clear the act break is, and it's just nonsense.
Yeah. And I do wonder if sometimes things like this aren't used as like a bludgeon against writers by studios, or maybe even between writers who are arguing about how something should go. If someone is like, well, I think this character should do this at this point, and maybe the other one has a credible reason not to, or maybe they don't, but they might object and say like, well, that doesn't cohere with our 3-act structure guideline, because at this point this should not happen yet, or whatever. And then it's like, okay, well, you've now missed the opportunity to have something like organic happen within the script in favor of adhering to your artificial structure, which is not going to be an improvement, because really, ultimately, like you can feel if something's going to work or not if you're writing.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be improved if you're like, well, this feels right, but I'm going to ruin it on purpose because it doesn't fit the structure.
I can tell you that absolutely is happening because one of the comments in one of the articles I read was talking about a guy who has a friend that's a screenwriter in the business and how he's witnessed him since he went off to film school, like his creativity be completely destroyed and evaporated. And it's gotten to a point where whenever they start a new screenplay, they have a template already built that breaks the acts by page number and then says something like, okay, page 15, you need your inciting incident to happen by this point. If it hasn't happened here, why not? Why is it happening on page 30? Why is it happening on page 5? Like, it's gotten to a point where the structure is so you're just writing to a template. And that's, if you're looking for why modern Hollywood blockbusters are bad at times, it's that kind of filmmaking right there.
Yeah. That's I always say limitations breed creativity, but that's a little bit it's a little bit too far.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think, our conclusion to this thing is everybody's right. I think there are very good things about this structure. Just through the process of breaking down Star Wars, it revealed an interesting discussion about Star Wars. And that's important. And when you're studying film theory, when you're trying to understand why does a story work, this is the way to do it. I don't even want to dismiss, like what you said, within the creative process itself, it can be an important tool to go back and make sure that you are achieving the objectives of what you're trying to write. I think it can help in that, but it's when it becomes that unbreakable rule that it becomes the problem.
Yeah, I think the only wrong way to use this is if you're watching a movie with a mental clipboard and then you walk out of the movie saying, well, I enjoyed that, but it didn't really adhere to the act structure that I approve of. Yeah. So I'm going to criticize it and write a bad review.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so that's our podcast on the 3-act structure. That was fun.
Yeah.
I think let's see if we've been watching anything lately, because I wanted to talk to you about a movie I saw.
Go for it.
I wanted to talk to you about Martin Scorsese's Silence.
Awesome.
It's been a couple weeks, or it's been a week since I've seen it now, maybe a little more. Matt, I am obsessed with this movie, and now I kind of want to break it down into an act structure, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to, but we've talked, I'm not sure if it's on air, but we've talked at long length about Scorsese's films and how meaty they are, and like how prone to constant pondering and dissection they are, and
misinterpretation.
Yeah, and misinterpretation, absolutely. This is absolutely one of those movies. And coming as I did from a raised Roman Catholic background, much like Martin Scorsese, who has constantly had come in conflict with the Roman Catholic faith, as Martin Scorsese is, this movie appealed to me almost specifically because it's very much a critique of like the Jesuit type of lifestyle, the strict adherence to Roman Catholic rules and traditions and the dogma around it. And it's really fascinating. And the thing I love about it the most is everyone comes to it with their own preconceptions, and everyone has different interpretations of it because of that. And they're all equally valid, in my opinion. People completely non-religious or non-spiritual come to it and see something else. My wife is a Christian, and she came to it and had a different interpretation than I did. It's and that's, to me, is the mark of just a great movie, the one that you can sit down and discuss for hours, and no one's specifically wrong in how they read the movie and how it impacted them. Yeah,
it sounds like I would really enjoy this.
I think you would.
For some reason, like, this type of thing sounds way more appealing to me than a gangster movie or anything else like that. So I'm looking forward to this.
And I think he's doing. I mean, he's always, like, the gangster movies have just in him been an exploration of culture, and he's kind of doing that here too. Only the culture is specific to religion and something that's obviously immensely personal to him, because he was almost a priest He was, I think, a day away from it, and then decided to make movies instead.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's you can see him in it, and I think that's wonderful. That you can both see his opinion and his feelings towards religion in the film, but still also walk away with your own interpretation. To me, is like the sign of a masterpiece.
Yeah. That's a priority for me to see.
Yeah, I think you'd really like it. It's very different from his other films too. It's a lot quieter. Silence. It's the camera work's not quite as bombastic as the stuff he used in like Wolf of Wall Street and Goodfellas and all that. It's very beautiful. It's long, like most of his movies, but I think the length really works here because it allows the moments to really sink in. And it's just it's such a good movie.
Yeah. I don't know. It's in theaters now?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm not sure. It'll probably be in for a little while longer. I'm not sure. Like, it weirdly has no Oscar buzz around it at all. I don't know if it's going to be. I don't know if it didn't like make cutoff. I thought it was playing in some theaters before the end of the year, so technically it would be qualified. But maybe they're just not running like any kind of campaign for it. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I'm sure if it was within last year, it'll win all kinds of things.
I would hope so, but you never know. Deadpool's going to get nominated for Best Picture, so that's the world.
Awesome.
That's the world we live in.
This is the branch of reality that we have fallen into.
All right, did you have anything that you had watched or read or anything since the last time we did this?
The only thing I can think of, I mean, I've watched a bunch of things, but the only thing I can think of, it's not a new thing. It's just that I happened to rewatch Fellowship of the Ring relatively recently, and it was cool because I had like forgotten that those were actually really great. I for some reason had just kind of been, I was so into Lord of the Rings. I'm one of those people who read all the books and all the supplementary stuff and saw the movies on opening night and everything, and had a one ring that I wore on a chain around my neck and learned to write Tengwar. And anyway, sort of was like, oh, I got burned out and I forgot that the movie was good. And I watched it again and I was like, oh man, this is a great movie. It really is. So everyone go rewatch Fellowship of the Ring.
Yeah, it's funny because we had that podcast, it was probably about this time last year, where we talked about the trilogy. And we were a little more negative on it. And I think when you watched it, you just watched the theatrical cut, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I think it's weird, like, from a structural perspective, to tie into our topic for today, I think the extended edition kills a lot of it. The stuff in there is cool for like us nerds that like all the details and want to see all that stuff, but for actual like momentum of story, the theatrical edition I think is just better. And I haven't watched the theatrical in such a long time that I wonder if I actually did that, if I would appreciate it more. That being said, I think Fellowship of the Ring is just about a perfect movie. I think the other two are very good, but I think Fellowship on its own is the most complete and well done film. Yeah,
it really stays, the theatrical cuts really stay focused on the where they should, on the characters, and the drama really, all of the beats really land. It surprised me because I had completely forgotten that I don't know how many minutes it is, but there's a surprisingly long prologue, if you will, to the movie, where it's basically Galadriel introducing the backstory, and you see all the like ancient time stuff, and goes through the battle with Sauron, and Gollum finds the ring and gets tortured. It's like, wow, this is really long and involved prologue. I wonder. What I was thinking when I saw it, as I was like, I wonder if people in like today's audience would find this corny, or if it just doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't, because you can sort of see how it would be corny, but I think the rest of the movie, it pulls you into its milieu so much that you're just like, yes, that is exactly the kind of thing that should happen in a movie like this, and I am in this world now.
Yeah, that's a good. I have no idea how to even comprehend that, like whether or not how they would interpret it. I don't know. That's tough.
Yeah, I mean, I guess people probably haven't changed that much in so many years, but I guess what was really happening was I hadn't thought it was corny when I was 16 or whatever, and then at 31, I'm like, God, it's a little bit I don't know why they did it quite that way, but then of course it works on you anyway, because it's sucking you into this like fantastic world, and you just have to buy into it.
Yeah, it was only 15 years ago. You're right, but I think blockbuster films have changed, fundamentally since then. And I really think The Lord of the Rings is a signifier of the change in films. There's the first really, like the first time they shot 3 movies at the same time. It's like the start of the cinematic universes that inhabit our lives now. Because I think Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter were happening at the same time, which is really the first time, I think, in history that sequels were not only like doing it, but kind of expecting to make more money than the last one. Like for the longest time in Hollywood, it was like the sequel will perform well, but it won't perform as well as the original. And then suddenly, with these expanding universe type stories, that was an expectation. And I think Lord of the Rings kind of started it all.
Yeah.
But it is a great film.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think that's all we had for this week. I could talk about Lord of the Rings with you for another hour if I wanted to, but
we could break it down into 5 acts.
I'm sure we could. There is a podcast going on right now, Matt, that's breaking down the entire works of Tolkien. It's a 18-month long thing. So if you want to listen to that, it's not me. I wish it was me. I wish I had that kind of knowledge to do that. But
wow.
But anyway, so that's all for us this week. Next week, I think we're going to try to do a Kryptonian collection. I'm not sure if that's going to work with all our schedules, but regardless, we'll be back next week with a new episode, whatever it is. And Matt, where can you be found on the internet?
I am a Twitterer at @MoreDinamail, and I write articles for DailyPlanetFilms.com.
All right. I am also a tweeterer at ScottDaly85. That's DALY. You can find information about this podcast and everything else we do on Twitter at Daly Planet Films or at dailyplanetfilms.com. You can also subscribe to one of our other podcasts, Phantom Zoned. I think that's at Phantom_Zoned, I think it is. That's the podcast Adrian hosts where we watch terrible movies and talk about them. And that's, I think you can subscribe on, Matt, refresh my memory, iTunes, Stitcher, any Android devices.
Yeah.
All
that's
that stuff.
Correct.
Subscribe.
Yeah. Or just in browser, you can just click
the play button. If you are using one of those apps, especially iTunes, please subscribe, please rate, and leave us reviews. We love reviews, and ratings push us up into that fancy list on iTunes, which determines the most popular podcasts, and we'd love to go higher on that list because that means more of you fine people will listen to us. So if you could just take a few minutes and do that, that would be awesome. But that's all we got. Matt, this was a lot of fun. Structure. Yeah. We should do this again with some other nebulous terms we use in the world of film.
Yeah. I would love to do a theory of storytelling series.
All right, that's it. You heard it here first, folks. We'll be back. All right, but we will see you all next week.